Imagine a world before letters were invented, before nations and flags, when humans lived under the same sky, yet knew nothing about each other. It was during this time that the earliest relationships were formed, filled with mystery, trust, and betrayal. This story takes us into the life of Naka, a young man from the Tana-Batamara clan, who is unwittingly entangled in a vortex of ancient secrets between blood and ancient pacts. A journey that takes him deep into the jungle, uncovering his mother's past, and uncovering truths long buried by the mists of time. What really happened in the relationships between clans in prehistoric times? To what extent can blood ties influence the fate of the future? Find out in this intriguing story. And if you felt anything while listening to this story, whether curiosity, surprise, or simply touched, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know which part gave you the most chills. Dawn in the land of red rocks. The morning mist still hung among the trees when Naka opened his eyes. The sound of wild birds called from afar, but what woke him wasn't their chirping, but rather a faint thump coming from the valley. It was an unusual sound, heavy and regular, like footsteps dragging on large stones. Naka wasn't a hunter. He wasn't yet 20 years old, but his mind was sharp, and his instincts were stronger than most of the men in his clan. He lived with his mother, Mira, a woman who had been a healer for the 3 great clans before they exiled themselves to the land of red rocks. That morning, Mira was nowhere to be found in the cave. Only the cold ashes of the stove and faint footprints left on the wet ground. Naka followed the trail without hesitation. He walked through thorny bushes, down a steep slope, until he reached the edge of a small, clear stream. There he saw something that disturbed his stomach. A strange symbol carved into a flat stone. It was a symbol Mira had never taught him, not one of the nighttime campfire stories. It was shaped like a sun split in two, and in the center, there was a deep crisscrossing line, as if carved with a sharp knife. Naka touched the stone, and a shiver ran down his spine. He felt as if he were being watched. His eyes scanned the forest, but there was no one there. Then the sound of heavy footsteps came again, this time closer. He quickly hid behind a bush and held his breath. The figure appeared, tall with dark skin and a body covered in old wounds. On his back hung a large stone weapon Naka had never seen before. The person stopped right in front of the carved stone. He stared at the symbol for a long moment, then turned toward the bush where Naka was hiding. Without a word, he walked away, crossed the river, and disappeared eastward. When the sound of his footsteps completely died away, Naka emerged from hiding. His hands were still trembling. He knew one thing for sure. Today was no ordinary day. And his mother, Mira, was hiding something big. A trail leading north. The sky was already starting to brighten when Naka returned to the cave. He brought with him a piece of bark and a small stone he had found near the river, hoping they would hold a clue. But when he arrived, he found something else. On the cave wall where Mira usually drew symbols of life, a new painting had appeared. It wasn't yet dry. The strokes were rough but full of pressure. A snake coiled around 3 red dots that resembled eyes. Naka knew this was no ordinary drawing. It was a message. But from whom? He sat in front of the wall for a long time, recalling the old stories Mira had whispered to him at night. About the people of the north who had a different language of pictures. About blood pacts made silently, only through carvings and gestures. As daylight began to rise, Naka decided to leave. He knew danger awaited, but his curiosity was greater than his fear. He carried a light spear and a leather pouch containing a small amount of water. His goal was clear: follow the direction north, the direction Mira had always forbidden him. He crossed fields of reeds and sharp rocks. He stopped several times to look for signs of life, and in the afternoon he found it. A burned-out camp. The ashes were still warm, and small bones were scattered about. But what stood out most was a piece of plant fiber cloth, a faint purple, a color worn only by the Baya. The Baya were legendary among the children of his clan. They were shadow hunters, never seen but always leaving a mark. If this was their doing, then Mira might have been captured or worse. Naka cautiously approached the ruins. Suddenly, a hissing sound came from behind a large rock. He turned quickly, raising his spear. But it wasn't an enemy he saw. A woman younger than Mira stood with a wound on her shoulder and a sharp gaze. She didn't say a word. But from her gaze, Naka knew she wasn't alone. The afternoon wind had begun to blow chillily. In the distance, the sound of a bone flute sounded weak, shrill, and mournful. Something was moving in the darkness. And Naka, for the first time in his life, felt his steps being watched by a force older than the oldest tree in the valley. Secrets in the mist. The woman stared at Naka without blinking. Blood still slowly flowed from her wound, but she stood her ground, as if the pain had become part of her being. Naka lowered his spear slowly, trying to read her intentions. The woman raised her hand and pointed north, then made a circular motion in the air, similar to the snake symbol Naka had seen on the cave wall. She said nothing, but her body conveyed a clear message. Follow me or remain in confusion. Naka hesitated but chose to follow. They walked silently among the ruins, following a path covered in dead leaves. The sky was gray, and the fog hung low, enveloping the forest like a thick blanket. The world seemed to turn into shadows, and all sounds were drowned out by the silence. In the midst of the dense forest, they came to a rocky hollow. There was a small cave, and at the mouth sat two old men with white beards and barely closed eyes. Between them stood Mira. She looked tired but unharmed. Her gaze was filled with surprise as she looked at Naka. But before he could speak, one of the elders raised his hand. He spoke softly, in a language Naka didn't understand. Mira responded in the same tone, but with greater emphasis. Then everything became clear. Mira wasn't just a healer. She was part of an ancient pact between the Tana Batamara clan and the Baya people. The symbols on the stone, the cave paintings, and the appearance of the bleeding young woman, all were a call to renew the ancient bond broken by the betrayal of the previous generation. The young woman turned out to be Myra's daughter, born in exile and raised by the Baya as the clan's secret keeper. She had no name, only a nickname, the Wound Keeper. The scar on her shoulder was the result of her resistance to the Baya group's attempts to sever the old bond and establish a new order. Naka, unbeknownst to her, had become a living witness to the revival of that ancient pact. She was chosen not for her strength or courage, but because her soul was untainted by revenge. That night, amidst the mist and the small flames of the fire, the two clans made a new pact. There was no grand ceremony, just a look, blood on her hands and scratches on the stone. Mira gazed at her children, Naka and the Wound Keeper, with deep eyes. She knew the old world was changing, and the once hidden relationships would now shape the future. As morning came, the fog began to lift. The forest spoke again. But the voice was different now. Something had shifted. A secret had been revealed, and Naka, once just a caveman, was now the keeper of a story that would never be recorded in stone, but lived in their very blood. The story would never end. It would only continue to change, from breath to breath, from clan to clan, until time forgot the form of the first human to see the sun split.